She hit the metal cart hard enough to rattle every instrument on it. The split in her lip opened before she even registered the pain. Warm, copper-tasting, immediate. The corridor froze. 37 people standing within eyeshot of Halloway General Medical Center's East Wing, and not one of them moved. Not one of them said a word. They just watched Dr. Elliot Marsh wipe his hands on a sterile cloth like he'd touched something dirty, step over the scattered supplies she'd knocked loose on her way down, and keep walking. Abigail Cole sat on the floor of the ER corridor for exactly 4 seconds. Then she got up. Nobody helped her up. Nobody asked if she was okay. And nobody, not one soul in that frozen hallway, ever thought to wonder who exactly they'd just watched hit the floor. That was the first mistake they made. It wouldn't be the last. If this story has you gripping your seat already, you haven't seen anything yet. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had started at 5:45 in the morning, which meant Abigail had been on her feet for 11 hours by the time the incident happened. Halloway General was the kind of hospital that ran perpetually short-staffed, the kind where nurses clocked 14-hour shifts and still got blamed when a physician's order wasn't filled fast enough. Located in the mid-sized city of Carver's Point, it sat in the geographic center of a community that was always one bad quarter away from losing its trauma center designation. The administration knew it, the staff knew it, and the surgeons who ran the ORs like personal kingdoms definitely knew it because it meant nobody was ever going to tell them no. Dr. Elliot Marsh was the worst of them. He was 49, chief of vascular surgery, and he had never once in his professional career been told that he did something wrong. His record showed 3 internal complaints, all closed without action. His malpractice file showed 2 settlements, both sealed. His staff reviews showed consistent commendations because the nurses and residents who wrote them knew what happened to the ones who didn't. He was the kind of man who walked down a hallway and expected it to part for him. And when it didn't, when something or someone was in his path, he didn't slow down. He just removed the obstacle. Abigail had been pushing a medication cart from room 12 toward the nursing station when Marsh came around the corner moving fast, already talking into his phone, surgical cap pushed back on his head. She'd seen him. She'd started to pull the cart to the right to give him room. It wasn't fast enough. His shoulder drove into hers with enough force that the cart swung sideways, caught her at the hip, and sent her into the wall. Her lip caught the corner of a supply shelf bracket on the way down. She tasted blood before her palms hit the floor. "Watch where you're going," he said, and kept walking. She got up. She used the wall to push herself upright, touched 2 fingers to her lip, looked at the blood, and started collecting the supplies that had scattered across the floor. Saline bags, a box of needles, 3 packet rolls of compression gauze. She picked them up methodically, one at a time, and put them back on the cart. When she straightened up, Renata Sims, one of the charge nurses who had been at Halloway for 8 years, was standing near the nurse's station, watching her with something between guilt and resignation. "You should put ice on that," Renata said. "I'm fine." "Abby, I said I'm fine." Abigail tucked the last gauze roll back into its place and locked the cart's wheel. "Does 1204 still need her noon meds?" Renata looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she looked away. "Yeah, she does." That was the conversation. The hallway emptied. The shift went on. But that was the thing about Abigail Cole. She had a way of making discomfort disappear simply by refusing to perform it for anyone. She was 32 years old, 5'6", and had the kind of face that read as forgettable if you weren't paying attention. Medium brown hair usually pulled into a low bun. Eyes that were a dark, settled gray. She wore her scrubs the same way every day. Same color, same fit, no distinguishing accessories. She arrived early and stayed late and did not make friends easily, because making friends required a kind of sustained openness she hadn't fully figured out how to maintain anymore. She had worked at Halloway for 14 months. Before that, there was a gap in her resume. 2 years where her employment history simply went blank. That HR had flagged when she applied and then stopped asking about when her references checked out so thoroughly that the HR manager had called one of them back a second time just to confirm the conversation had been real. The references confirmed it. HR stopped asking. Nobody at Holloway knew what she'd done before the 2 years of silence. They knew she'd had military service. There was a VA discount sticker on her car, and she sometimes used terminology that belonged in a briefing room rather than a nursing station. But specifics were something she never volunteered, and nobody had the relationship with her to press for them. She was efficient, she was quiet, and she showed up every day without complaint, which in a perpetually understaffed ER made her approximately the most valuable employee in the department, even if nobody framed it that way. What they framed it as, mostly, was lucky to have a job. Marsh had said it to her directly 3 weeks ago when she'd flagged a dosage concern on a post-op patient and he'd overridden her recommendation. "You're a nurse, Ms. Cole, not a physician. You're fortunate this hospital gives nurses the latitude to make observations at all." He'd said it in front of 2 residents and another nurse. None of them had said anything, neither had she. The patient's dosage had been corrected 12 hours later when a second physician reviewed the chart and quietly put in the change. Marsh never acknowledged it. Nobody connected the dots, or if they did, they kept it to themselves. The ER got loud around 7 in the evening, which was normal for a Tuesday. Carver's Point wasn't a particularly violent city, but it had a highway interchange 5 miles out that generated a reliable volume of trauma calls. And in the warmer months, the construction crews working the new bridge expansion produced their own steady trickle of fractures, lacerations, and crush injuries. Abigail worked the floor without stopping, moving between beds, managing IVs, doing the math in her head on fluid rates, and timing the way some people do crossword puzzles, automatically, without effort, the way a skill embeds itself when you've used it in conditions where getting it wrong meant watching someone bleed out on a hillside with no OR, no attending physician, and no second chances. She didn't let herself think about that. She was hanging a new drip bag on bed 7 when the radio call came in from the paramedics. She could hear it from the nursing station, loud enough to cut through the ambient noise, the specific clipped urgency that paramedics used when they were genuinely frightened. Holloway ER, incoming trauma, GSW, male, mid-30s, 2 center mass, 1 penetrating left shoulder, significant blood loss, BP 70 over palp and dropping. ETA 4 minutes. The charge RN, a brisk woman named Marcus Howell, who despite the name went by the job title without hesitation, started coordinating the trauma bay immediately. Bed assignments, call to the blood bank, paging the on-call surgeon. Abigail finished the drip bag, checked the connection, and moved toward the trauma bay. She wasn't assigned to it. Technically, she was still responsible for the med-surg overflow patients she'd been managing since 5 o'clock. But she changed course anyway, because something in the sound of that radio call had registered in a part of her brain that medical training alone doesn't build. The ambulance doors opened at 7:14. The paramedic, young, visibly shaken in the way that took training to suppress, was giving vitals as they rolled the gurney through. 2 bullet entry points, chest, confirmed. 1 shoulder wound, likely through and through. IV line in the left forearm, second line attempted right AC, blown. Manual pressure on the shoulder. The patient was conscious. That was the first thing Abigail noticed when she got close enough to see his face. He was conscious, which under these circumstances was both good and deeply concerning, and he was using that consciousness to look around the bay with the particular kind of focused awareness that she recognized as someone who had been trained to never lose track of their surroundings, even when their body was failing. Combat awareness. She knew it because she'd had it herself. The second thing she noticed was that his face was familiar. She went still for exactly 1 second, 1 breath, and then she put that information somewhere it couldn't interfere with function and stepped forward to take over pressure on the shoulder wound from the paramedic. The trauma team moved around her, calling out findings and status updates, and she worked within the space they allowed her, one hand maintaining firm compression while the physician on duty, a capable ER attending named Dr. Sasha Werner, started rapid assessment. The patient's eyes swept the room, stopped on Abigail. She felt it. She didn't look up. "Abby." His voice was rough, thin, breath coming short. "Abby Cole." She looked at him then. "Hey, Marcus," she said quietly. His name, his real name, was Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb. He looked like he'd aged 5 years since she'd last seen him, which tracked, given what the last 5 years had probably involved. He had a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 or 4 days, a forearm tattoo she didn't recognize, and 2 bullets in his chest, but his eyes were clear and direct, and he was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room that made any sense. "You're still here," he said. "Hold still," she said. "I need you to—" "Not now." She adjusted the compression angle, felt the pressure stabilize marginally. "Stay with me. Tell me later." Dr. Werner looked between them briefly, registered whatever was happening with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to triage every situation, and continued her assessment. "Cole, can you maintain that position?" "Yes." "Then stay there, Mus." The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos, which was the most honest way to describe a trauma resuscitation when it was going well. Marcus held on with the stubbornness of someone who had decided not to die and was treating the decision as final. His pressure climbed off the floor with fluids and blood products. The shoulder wound was messy, but the major vessels had been missed by a margin that constituted either extraordinary luck or extraordinary aim. The chest wounds were the real problem. Both had penetrated the thoracic cavity, one dangerously close to the cardiac border, and he was going to need surgical intervention before anything else. The OR was already being prepped. The on-call surgeon, a general surgery fellow named Dr. Peterson Aguilar, was on his way down. Abigail stayed with Marcus through the assessment, kept the shoulder controlled, watched his O2 sats with the particular attention she'd learned to pay when monitors weren't always available and pattern recognition was the only tool on hand. It was during the brief window between assessment and transport, 2 minutes, maybe 3, where the room's momentum shifted from incoming crisis to organized response, that Marcus grabbed her wrist with his uninjured hand. "Don't let Aguilar go in there without knowing about the shrapnel," he said. "Left side lower thorax, 6 years old. Not on any scan unless they know to look." Abigail looked at him. "Residual shrapnel?" "Encapsulated, stable for years. But if he doesn't know it's there and he's working that cavity, I'll tell him." "Tell him before, not during." "I'll tell him before." His grip loosened slightly. He hadn't let go entirely. "You look different," he said. "Normal. You look too normal. You look like you got shot twice. 3 times. The paramedic missed one." She checked his right side immediately, ran her hand along the lateral torso, and found it, a wound she'd missed because it was low and partially obscured by the gurney padding, shallow by the look of it, but a penetrating wound nonetheless. She called it out immediately, rerouted the trauma team's attention, got a second set of hands on the new site within 40 seconds. She had found it before any of the attending physicians did. Dr. Werner noticed. She didn't say anything, but Abigail saw her make a mental note. Aguilar arrived at 7:42, efficient, confident, slightly short-tempered in the way of surgeons who got woken up and didn't enjoy it. Abigail flagged him before he reached Marcus's bedside. "You need to know about retained shrapnel before you open that chest," she said. He looked at her with the reflexive, mildly irritated expression of a surgeon being told something by a nurse. "I'll review the scans." "The scans won't show it. It's been encapsulated for 6 years, lower left thorax. The patient told me directly, you're going to want to know its position before you work near the cardiac margin." Aguilar stopped, looked at her more carefully. "And you are?" "Abigail Cole. I work this floor." "What's your basis for flagging this?" "You've reviewed encapsulated shrapnel presentations before?" "Yes." She didn't elaborate. "The patient is reliable. He would know." Aguilar held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Marcus, then back at her. Something in her delivery, in the flat certainty of it, reached through the standard dismissiveness. "I'll do an intraoperative palpation sweep before I approach that margin," he said. "That's what I'd do," she said. He went in to review Marcus's chart without another word. Whether he believed her or just decided it was a low-cost precaution, she didn't know. It didn't matter. The outcome was what mattered. Marcus went to the OR at 8:15. The floor quieted in that particular way it did after a major trauma, cleared the bay. Not empty, never empty, but decompressed, running at the lower register of controlled urgency rather than the higher one. Abigail went back to her regular patients. She was charting at the nurse's station around 9 o'clock when Renata sat down next to her with a coffee she hadn't asked for and set it beside her keyboard without comment. "You knew him," Renata said. "Who?" "GSW, Bay 1. Abigail kept typing. "We've met before." Renata was quiet for a moment. "He said your name before he said anything else. Before the doors were fully open. He was in shock. People say things." "He said it clearly," Renata said, "like he was looking for you, specifically." Abigail saved her chart entry and opened the next one. "He's in surgery. He'll be fine. Aguilar's good." "Aguilar's very good," Renata agreed. Then, "Dr. Marsh filed a report this afternoon." That made Abigail pause. "About the corridor incident," Renata continued. "He filed it first, said you stepped into his path and caused him to knock into you, and that you created a disruption that impacted patient care." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "He filed it first," she repeated. "Yeah." Renata's voice had that flat, careful quality of someone delivering bad news they've been rehearsing. "So if you file a response, it's already a he said, she said situation. He's anticipating." "He does this often?" "Twice before, that I know of. Both times the other person didn't respond, so Marsh's version became the record." Renata wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you how it works here." Abigail looked at her. "How long have you been here?" 8 years. "And in 8 years, how many times did you say something?" Renata didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Abigail turned back to her screen. "I'll deal with it." "Abby, he has friends on the board. The chief of staff plays golf with him every—" "I said I'll deal with it." Her tone wasn't sharp exactly. It was something quieter than sharp and more final. The conversation was over. Renata took her coffee and went back to her station. At 10:53, 3 things happened in quick succession. The first, Dr. Aguilar emerged from the OR to report that Marcus's surgery had gone well. The encapsulated shrapnel had been exactly where Abigail said it would be, 2 centimeters from where Aguilar had initially intended to approach the cardiac margin. He'd logged it in the operative report without further comment, but when he passed through the ER afterward, he paused at the nursing station and looked at Abigail across the room for a moment before he walked on. The second, Abigail's access badge was suspended. She found out when she tried to pull a controlled medication for one of her patients, and the system flagged her ID as inactive. She went to the nursing station, tried her badge on the computer terminal. Same result. Renata checked from her end and came back looking uncomfortable. "Your credentials were suspended effective 10 p.m., Renata said quietly. "Administrative hold. They're citing the incident report Marsh filed, plus a complaint about the patient interaction in Bay 1, that you intervened outside your assigned scope. I was maintaining wound compression under an attending's direct instruction. I know that. Aguilar flagged me to stay. I have a witness. I know that too." Renata lowered her voice further. "Abby, they moved fast. This isn't normal processing. Normal processing takes 2 business days. This came from above Marsh. Somebody wanted you gone tonight." Abigail looked at her badge. She set it down on the counter with a quiet click. "Who authorized it?" "Deputy Administrator Croft." Renata paused. "He's also on the board. The same board Marsh played golf with. The same board that had closed 3 complaints without action. The same board that had sealed 2 malpractice settlements." Abigail was beginning to understand the shape of what she was looking at, and it was considerably older and more organized than a surgeon who didn't watch where he was walking. "I need my personal items from the locker room," she said. "I can walk you." "I know where it is." She walked out of the nursing station without hurrying, down the corridor, left at the junction, through the door marked Staff Only. Inside, she opened her locker and took out her jacket, her bag, her phone. She stood for a moment with her hand flat against the locker door. 11 hours. She'd been here since before 6 in the morning, and now it was nearly 11 at night, and they were sending her home without a conversation, without a formal process, without anything except a badge deactivation that some deputy administrator had pushed through in 45 minutes flat. She thought about Marcus in the recovery unit somewhere above her, waking up from anesthesia into a hospital where the one person who knew his history had just been removed. She thought about the way he'd grabbed her wrist. Don't let Aguilar go in there without knowing about the shrapnel. She thought about the fact that Marcus Webb had last known location-wise been stationed somewhere she wasn't supposed to know about, running operations she definitely wasn't supposed to know about, and he had arrived tonight in the ER of a hospital in Carver's Point with 3 bullet wounds and her name on his lips. She closed the locker. She put on her jacket. She walked back out into the hallway with her bag over one shoulder, and she stopped when she nearly collided with a man coming fast around the corridor junction who was most emphatically not a hospital employee. He was wearing civilian clothes, jacket, dark pants, but his posture was wrong for a visitor, and wrong for press, and wrong for a family member. He was scanning the hallway the way you scanned a hallway when you were looking for a specific target and you'd been given a description but not a photo. His eyes moved across her and then snapped back. Stopped. She kept her face neutral, kept walking, turned left at the junction when she should have turned right for the exit, and took the corridor toward the stairwell instead, and she heard him pause behind her for 1 second before he started following. She didn't run. She didn't give him the satisfaction of running, but her pulse had shifted from the steady clinical pace she'd held for 11 hours into something older and faster, something that recognized the specific texture of being hunted. She'd felt this before, in environments where the stakes were immediate and the exits were limited, and the only thing between her and the wrong outcome was the ability to think 3 seconds ahead of everyone else in the room. She pushed through the stairwell door. The man behind her was 10 paces back. She took the stairs at a pace that wasn't quite a run but covered ground fast, pulling the rhythm from muscle memory, movement in enclosed spaces, vertical transitions, noise management. She cleared the first landing, heard the door below her open. She reached the second floor, opened the door, stepped through, and let it close behind her. Recovery unit. Quieter up here. Dim lighting. A nurse at the far station who didn't look up. Marcus's room was 214. She checked the board before the suspension hit. She walked to 214 and stepped inside and pulled the door almost closed behind her. Marcus was awake. His color was still poor and the monitors above his bed were running quiet, steady rhythms. Surgery had gone well. Aguilar had said so, and the numbers bore it out. But he was awake, and when she came through the door, his hand moved toward the call button before he saw her face and stopped. "I've got about 30 seconds, she said. "There's a man in the building. He came in after visiting hours. No ID, no badge. He made me in the ER corridor." Marcus's eyes sharpened immediately. "How many?" "I only saw one." "There'll be more." She looked at him. "Tell me what happened." His jaw tightened. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "I was carrying evidence," he said. "Physical evidence, files. I had a contact here in Carver's Point, a federal agent, someone I trust. I was bringing the package to her before they realized I'd taken it. They realized faster than I expected." "Who's they?" He looked at her steadily. "Marcus. It goes higher than anyone in this building knows," he said, "including you. Especially you." He paused. "They know about you, Abby. They know who you were. They pulled your file 6 days ago. I should have warned you, but I didn't know I was compromised until—" The door handle moved, not the quiet testing motion of a nurse checking a room, the deliberate, careful turn of someone who didn't want to make noise. Abigail stepped back from the bed, put herself between the door and Marcus without choosing to do it consciously. It was the geometry of the situation, the automatic placement that came from years of putting herself between danger and the people she was responsible for protecting. The door opened. The man from the corridor stood in the frame. He was taller than she'd registered in motion. He had his right hand inside his jacket in a way that was professionally subtle and professionally clear. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You need to leave this room," she said. He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his jaw. "Miss Cole," he said, "you need to come with me." She didn't move. Neither did he. The moment stretched in that particular way moments do when both people in a room have assessed each other's capabilities and are deciding whether the next 30 seconds are worth the cost. He had size on her, maybe 50 pounds and 4 inches, and he had whatever was under his jacket, which she was operating on the assumption was not a clipboard. What he didn't have was any visible backup in the doorway, and he didn't have certainty about her, which was evident in the fact that he'd opened that door slowly instead of fast. Slow doors meant he'd been told to be careful. People gave that instruction when they knew something. "You're bleeding through your jacket," she said. He blinked, looked down. Involuntary, fast, the kind of check you do before your brain tells your body not to. She moved, not toward him, sideways, toward the monitor bank beside Marcus's bed, because she'd already clocked the crash cart in the corner and the positioning of the IV pole and the emergency call cord that was looped on the bed rail within reach. She grabbed the IV pole, aluminum, 5 feet tall, heavy base, and she didn't swing it. She drove it forward like a battering ram, straight into his center mass. And when he staggered back, she hooked her foot behind his ankle and he went down into the doorframe hard enough that the impact rang out into the corridor. She was through the door and moving before he finished falling. Not running, fast walking, the specific purposeful pace that doesn't trigger the chase instinct the way running does, that reads from a distance as staff on a mission. Her bag was still over her shoulder. She kept her hands loose at her sides. The nurse at the far station looked up and she held up 2 fingers. The universal hospital gesture for, "I need someone in room 214, calibrated to look like a clinical request and not what it actually was." The nurse picked up her phone. Abigail turned the corner and went for the north stairwell. She came out on the ground floor in the maintenance corridor rather than the main hall, a route she'd learned in her second week at Halloway simply because she was the kind of person who learned the secondary routes before she needed them. Through the double doors marked facilities, past the laundry intake, out through the loading bay exit that alarmed but only on the second beep, which she'd also noted. Outside, the air was cool and damp in the way of Carver's Point in early October, that specific mid-autumn pressure that meant rain was close. She crossed the ambulance bay at a diagonal, moving toward the far edge of the parking structure, where the security cameras had a 40-degree blind spot she'd identified the first month she'd worked here. She stopped in the shadow of a concrete column and stood very still. 3 minutes. She gave herself 3 minutes to breathe and think. Marcus had said physical evidence. Files. He'd had a federal contact in Carver's Point, someone he trusted, and he'd been shot before he could make delivery. Which meant the evidence, wherever it was either still on him when the paramedics brought him in, or he'd already moved it, or the people who shot him had recovered it and the whole thing was already finished. But if it was already finished, the man in the corridor would have left rather than following her. He'd followed her, which meant they either thought she had the evidence or they thought Marcus had told her where it was. She hadn't given him time to tell her anything except the broad shape of what he was carrying. She didn't know who the federal contact was. She didn't know where the files were. She was operating on partial information in a parking garage at 11:30 at night, while a man with a gun recovered on the second floor of the building she'd just been fired from. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact listed only as D. Moreau. It rang 4 times. Then, "Who is this?" Not a question. A challenge. "It's Cole." A pause that lasted about 2 seconds. "Where are you?" "Carver's Point, Halloway General. I've got a situation." "How big?" She thought about Marcus in the recovery room, about the man in the jacket, about the badge deactivation that had come through in 45 minutes. "Medium to large," she said. "Leaning large." "Are you secure?" "For now." "Stay on. I'm moving." She kept the line open and watched the loading bay entrance from the shadow of the column. No one came through. After 4 minutes, a black SUV pulled into the far end of the ambulance bay, and a woman got out, short, somewhere in her 50s, silver hair cut close to her skull, wearing a coat that was too heavy for the temperature and carrying herself like someone who had spent a long time being the most dangerous person in any given room and had learned to make it look effortless. Abigail recognized her before she crossed half the distance between them. Colonel Diane Moreau, United States Army, retired, who was not, in any functional sense of the word, actually retired. Abigail hadn't seen her in 16 months. "Tell me," Moreau said when she was close enough not to need volume. Abigail told her. Compact, in order, the way she'd been trained to deliver a field report. Situation, personnel, timeline, what she knew and what she didn't. She gave it in under 2 minutes. Moreau listened without interrupting. When Abigail finished, Moreau was quiet for a moment. "Webb made it out of surgery," she said. "He's in recovery, 2nd floor." "He was carrying a physical drive," Moreau said. "Encrypted." 12 gigabytes of documentation covering procurement fraud, forged supply contracts, and 6 confirmed casualty events that were classified as accidental. 4 years of records. She paused. He was supposed to deliver it to an FBI field agent named Harlow Bricks. Bricks is based here. He mentioned a federal contact. He didn't say who. Because he didn't know if you were still cleared. Moreau's voice was flat, factual, without apology. We didn't know you were here until 6 days ago, and by then Webb was already in motion. He said they pulled my file. They did. Someone in the network ran a search on former personnel connected to the original operations. Your name came up. Moreau looked at her steadily. They were going to get to you eventually. Webb coming here may have accelerated the timeline, but it didn't create the problem. The problem already existed. Abigail absorbed this. The drive. Still missing. Webb couldn't have had it on him when the paramedics arrived. They would have logged it. He either moved it before he was shot, or he stashed it during transport. Moreau paused. He's the only person who knows where it is. He's in recovery. I know. He's not in a position to go anywhere. No. Moreau looked back at the building. But whoever is in that building with him is going to reach the same conclusion, and they're going to be a lot less polite about asking. Getting back inside was the less complicated problem. Moreau had credentials that opened the administrative entrance on the east side. Not forged, not borrowed, something official enough that the security system accepted them without pause. Abigail went in ahead of her, moving through the main floor with the deliberate calm of someone who belonged there. Her badge was suspended, which meant the keycard readers would flag her, so she stayed in the corridors that didn't require card access and took the service elevator rather than the main. Second floor. The nurse who'd been at the station was gone, probably in with a patient. The corridor was quiet. Room 214 had a man posted outside it who was not a Holloway employee. He was doing a reasonable impression of someone leaning against the wall checking his phone, but his weight was wrong, too balanced, too ready, and his eyes came up before his head did when she appeared at the far end of the corridor, which was the tell. She stopped. Behind her, Moreau materialized from the stairwell door. Abigail looked at the man outside 214, looked back at Moreau. Moreau gave a very small nod that meant yours if you want it, which was the closest she ever came to asking a question. Abigail walked toward the room. I'm the patient's nurse, she said when she was 10 feet out. Coming for a vitals check. The patient's sleeping, he said. That's fine, I'll be quick. He said he didn't want to be disturbed. Post-surgical patients don't always remember what they've said. I need 30 seconds with the monitor. He was deciding. She could see the calculation happening. She looked like what she said she was. She sounded like what she said she was. And disrupting a nurse in a hospital corridor was the kind of scene that drew witnesses. He stepped sideways. She went through the door. Marcus was awake and watching the door with the wary alertness of someone who had been expecting the wrong person. When he saw her, something in his shoulders released about 2%. Not much, but she caught it. You have maybe 4 minutes, she said quietly. The drive. Where is it? He looked at her for a beat too long. You talked to Moreau. She's in the hall. She's here? He tried to sit up and grimaced. The surgery was recent enough that the pain medication was the only thing keeping the damage managed, and movement was its own argument. Tell her I need 5 minutes. You don't have 5 minutes. The drive, Marcus. He settled back against the pillow. His jaw worked. This was, she recognized, not reluctance to tell her. It was the particular frustration of someone deciding the fastest way to explain something complicated. I didn't have it when the paramedics found me, he said. I moved it before I made the call. Gave it to someone I trusted to hold it until I could make contact with Bricks. Who? A paramedic. Young woman, early 20s. She was the first responder on scene. She reached me before her partner. I had maybe 40 seconds while he was calling it in. He looked at Abigail steadily. She took it. She didn't know what it was, but she took it, and I told her to put it somewhere nobody would look. You gave classified evidence to a civilian paramedic. I gave it to the only person available who wasn't already compromised. His voice was even. I've made worse calls. That was almost certainly true. Her name? Abigail asked. She gave me her badge ID. I memorized it. 4417, Carver's Point EMS. Last name started with V. That's what you've got. I was shot 3 times. Fair point. She heard something in the corridor, a shift in the ambient noise, a different quality of silence than what had been there when she came in. She crossed to the door, opened it 2 inches, looked out. The man who'd been posted outside was no longer leaning against the wall. He was on the floor. Moreau was crouched beside him, 2 fingers against his neck, checking pulse with the professional efficiency of someone who had done this before and felt no particular need to be dramatic about it. She looked up at Abigail and shook her head slightly. Not dead, unconscious. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and nodded toward the stairwell. They needed to move. The next hour was logistics, and logistics was its own kind of warfare. Moreau worked the phone while Abigail sat in the front seat of the SUV parked 2 blocks from Halloway with a paper cup of terrible vending machine coffee she'd obtained in the 90 seconds she'd spent in the lobby before leaving. She tracked the steam rising off the surface and made herself drink it because she'd been awake for going on 18 hours, and she was going to need clarity in the next few hours more than she'd needed it all day. The paramedic with the badge ID 4417 turned out to be Nadia Vasquez, 23, 14 months on the job with Carver's Point EMS, no priors, no flags, currently 20 minutes into a shift break at Station 6 on the south side of the city. Moreau had this information in 11 minutes. Abigail did not ask how. They drove to Station 6 with Moreau's credentials visible on the dash in case they got stopped, which they didn't. The station was a low concrete building adjacent to a gas station, brightly lit inside, with 2 ambulances visible through the bay doors. Abigail went in alone because 2 people arriving at midnight looked like a problem, while 1 person looked like a liaison. Nadia Vasquez was sitting at a break room table eating a sandwich and looking at her phone with the flat exhaustion of someone who had been running calls for 6 hours and had stopped being surprised by anything the city produced. She was exactly what Marcus had described, young, direct-eyed, unremarkable at first glance, and when Abigail sat down across from her, she looked up without the wariness Abigail had expected. "You're from the hospital," Nadia said. "You recognize me?" "No. But you've got hospital on you, the way you sit." She put down her sandwich. "You're here about the guy from tonight." "Yes." Nadia studied her for a moment. She had the look of someone weighing options quickly, which was not a skill most 23-year-olds had, and which told Abigail something about the kind of situation she'd learned in. "He said someone would come," Nadia said. "He said if someone came and mentioned the package, I should ask for a confirmation word." Abigail blinked. "He gave you a confirmation word?" "The man with 3 bullets in him was very organized," Nadia said. "Yeah, he gave me a word." "Marcus Webb," Abigail thought, "you absolute professional." "I don't have the word," she said. "He didn't tell me. But I can tell you his name, his rank, his unit assignment as of 4 years ago, and the location of the encapsulated shrapnel in his lower left thorax that he told me about while you were probably still taking his vitals. Whatever he told you in 40 seconds on that roadside, I can tell you the 20 years before it." Nadia looked at her steadily. "His name," she said. "Marcus Webb. Sergeant First Class. Unit," Abigail told her. She kept her voice level and didn't elaborate, because the unit designation was specific enough that saying it too loudly in a brightly lit break room felt wrong on a cellular level. Nadia picked up her sandwich, took 1 more bite, put it back down, and stood up. She went to her jacket, hanging on a hook by the door, and reached into the inner chest pocket. She pulled out a sealed evidence pouch, the kind paramedics carried for biohazard handling, and set it on the table. Inside the opaque plastic, Abigail could make out the flat rectangular shape of a data drive. "He said whoever came for it would be trustworthy or would be dangerous," Nadia said. "He said I'd know the difference." "How do you know I'm not dangerous?" "Dangerous people don't say I don't have the word when they don't have it," Nadia said. "They make one up and hope for the best." She pushed the pouch across the table. "Whatever's on that thing, is it going to matter?" Abigail looked at the drive, at 12 gigabytes of documentation that men had already died over. "Yes," she said. "Okay." Nadia sat back down. "Then take it." She was back in the SUV within 4 minutes. She handed the pouch to Moreau without ceremony, and Moreau turned it over twice in her hands, checking the seal, checking the weight, and then placed it in a hard-sided case in the back seat that locked with a key she kept on her person. Webb was right to trust the paramedic, Moreau said. He usually makes good calls. Abigail looked out the windshield. The gas station across the street was pumping fluorescent light into the wet dark, and a man was filling his tank with the slow patience of someone going nowhere particular. What happens now? I contact Bricks, tonight. The drive goes into federal custody before morning. Moreau started the engine. You need to go somewhere that isn't your apartment. My apartment's fine. The man who followed you in the corridor didn't find you on his own, Abigail. Someone fed him your location within the hospital, which means someone who had access to the staff directory. Marsh filed the suspension report. Croft processed it. Either of them could have passed my ID. Or someone above both of them. Moreau pulled out of the parking space. Until we know the chain, you're exposed. We find you somewhere neutral for the next 12 hours. Abigail wanted to argue. She looked at the evidence case in the back seat and thought about the man on the floor outside room 214 and about the fact that 3 people knew where she'd gone tonight, and one of them was waking up with a headache right now and would shortly be making a phone call. 12 hours, she said, probably less if Bricks moves fast. And Holloway, Marsh, the suspension? Moreau glanced at her. One crisis at a time. Marsh put his hands on a staff member in front of 30 witnesses, Abigail said. Her voice was flat. He filed a preemptive report to cover it. The same board that protects him processed my suspension in 45 minutes. That's not a separate problem. That's connected to the same system that let people like the man in that corridor operate without consequences for 4 years. Moreau was quiet. I know, she said. So when it falls apart, when all of it falls apart, Holloway is part of that. I understand what you're saying. I'm saying I'm not going to disappear into 12 hours of safe and come out the other side with none of this addressed. Moreau turned onto the main road heading south. The city moved past the windows in the particular amber and shadow of streetlights and rain. She drove the way she did everything, efficiently, without wasted motion. And for a long time, she didn't respond. You're not going to disappear, she said finally, but you need to be upright and functional when it matters. She paused. Marcus is going to need backup when they realize the drive is gone. Bricks is going to need someone who can corroborate the operational context for what's on that drive. And whatever is about to happen at Holloway General is going to need someone who was in that building on that shift watching what those people did, who can say so clearly and under oath. She looked at Abigail briefly. That person needs to sleep. Abigail turned back to the window. Fine, she said. They drove south. The rain started at the edge of the city, soft at first, then harder, tapping against the roof of the SUV in the specific rhythm that Abigail had always found easier to sleep through than silence. She didn't sleep, not yet. But she let her shoulders drop half an inch, and she watched the headlights of the cars coming the other direction, and she didn't, for the first time in 18 hours, try to be ready for what came next. She'd be ready for what came next when it arrived. It arrived at 3:17 in the morning. Moreau's phone lit up the interior of the car with a single text. She read it at a red light, and the expression that crossed her face was not one Abigail had seen often. It sat somewhere between controlled alarm and the very specific look of someone whose operational timeline had just been compressed by an outside force. What? Abigail said. Moreau handed her the phone. The text was from an unknown number, and it read, Webb moved from recovery. Not our people. Building compromised. Bricks unreachable. Abigail read it twice. Someone took Marcus out of the recovery unit, she said. Or he moved himself, Moreau said. He's done it before. He's 24 hours post-surgery. He's also Marcus Webb. That was true. It was also not reassuring. Abigail handed the phone back. Who sent this? Someone I trust. From inside Holloway? Moreau didn't answer, which was an answer. Abigail looked at the evidence case in the back seat. 12 gigabytes, 4 years. 6 casualty events listed as accidental, which meant 6 sets of families who had been told a story that wasn't true. She thought about what it would mean if that drive disappeared again tonight. If bricks couldn't be reached, if whatever Moreau's contact meant by building compromised was as bad as the phrasing suggested. "Turn around," Abigail said. "Abigail, turn around." Her voice was quiet and very clear. "Marcus is in that building, and we have the only thing they're willing to kill people for. We go back." Moreau was already slowing for a U-turn. She didn't argue. She knew Abigail well enough to know that the conversation was over, and she had known, probably, since the moment the phone lit up, that they were going back regardless of what she said. The SUV pulled a U-turn in the empty street, and the headlights swept across the rain-slicked asphalt and pointed north, back toward Holloway General, where somewhere inside the building, on which floor, in which room, with how many people around him, she didn't know, Marcus Webb had just become the most urgent problem she had. And 3 blocks ahead, caught briefly in the headlights before the angle shifted, a second car pulled a matching U-turn, following them. Abigail caught the following car in her peripheral vision and said nothing for exactly 4 seconds while she confirmed it wasn't coincidence. Same speed, same lane, matching the SUV's deceleration through the turn with the practiced patience of a tail that had done this before. "We've got company," she said. Moreau had already seen it. 1 vehicle, 2 occupants, front seat. Same people as the hospital? Different car. Could be a second team. Moreau's hands didn't move on the wheel. Her voice stayed at the same register it always did, which was the most unsettling thing about her in moments like this. She sounded like she was discussing a weather system. "We can't lead them to Holloway. We can't not go to Holloway." "I know." Moreau took a right onto a surface street without signaling. The following car took the same turn 8 seconds later. "There's a parking structure 2 blocks north, 3 levels, 2 exits. If we go in one and they follow, we can split them from the vehicle. And then? And then we improvise." Abigail had spent enough time operating alongside Diane Moreau to know that improvise in her vocabulary meant something considerably more structured than it did for most people. She checked the evidence case was secured in the back, confirmed the latching mechanism, and then looked at what was available in the SUV's immediate environment. Standard load for a vehicle Moreau operated, which meant there was more than what was visible. She found what she needed in the door pocket in the center console. Not much, but enough for someone who understood leverage. The parking structure entrance appeared on the left. Moreau pulled in without slowing, took the ramp fast, went to the 3rd level, top deck, open air, rain coming down steady now, 2 other cars parked at the far end and nobody visible. She positioned the SUV with its front facing the exit ramp and cut the engine. The following car came up the ramp 40 seconds later. It stopped 20 feet out. Both doors opened. The 2 men who got out were not the same man who had followed Abigail in the hospital corridor. They were wearing the kind of nondescript clothing that announced professional intent more clearly than any uniform. Dark, functional, unremarkable. One was heavier, moving with the deliberate weight of someone who trusted size. The other was compact and stayed near the car, which meant he was the one she needed to watch. Moreau got out of the driver's side. Abigail got out of the passenger side and moved left immediately, putting space between herself and Moreau, because 2 targets spread wide were a different equation than 2 targets bunched together. "You have something that belongs to someone," the heavier man said. "That's a vague accusation," Moreau said. "The drive." He stopped 10 feet out. "Hand it over and this ends clean." "Does it?" "For you, yes." He looked at Moreau with the particular confidence of someone who knew his employer's reach and had let it replace his own judgment. "You're retired, Colonel. You don't have coverage anymore. Whatever you think this is, you're alone." Moreau considered this for a moment. "Abigail," she said. "Yeah. The man by the car is left-handed." The compact man by the car moved. Abigail was already moving in the opposite direction, not away from him, but on an angle that changed his approach geometry and forced him to recalculate mid-step. She closed distance rather than creating it, which was the thing most people didn't expect, and she used the physics of the rain-slicked concrete and his own forward momentum to redirect rather than block, because blocking a man with 50 pounds on her was a transaction she would lose. He hit the concrete on his side. Not clean. Her knee caught the edge of the car bumper on the way through, and she felt it, a hot flare of pain below her kneecap that she filed away for later. She maintained position over him, and he was deciding his next move, and she let him see in her face that she had already decided hers and was waiting, which was sometimes enough. It was enough. Behind her, the brief specific sounds of Moreau resolving the other situation. It was over in under a minute. Neither man was dead. Both were significantly committed to staying on the ground. Moreau retrieved a phone from the heavier man's jacket, looked at the most recent call log, and showed it to Abigail without comment. The last outgoing call had been placed from inside Holloway General, time-stamped 41 minutes ago, from a number that meant nothing to her, but clearly meant something to Moreau, because she photographed the screen and sent the image to someone before she pocketed her own phone. "Croft," Moreau said, "Deputy Administrator." "He's in the building this late?" "Apparently." Abigail looked at her knee, which was starting to stiffen. She straightened it carefully, tested the weight. Functional. She'd be walking with a limp in an hour, but she'd be walking. "Then he knows we're coming." "Yes." Moreau was already back at the SUV, retrieving the evidence case and repositioning it in an interior bag she wore under the coat. "Which means we stop assuming we have time." They went in through the hospital's east utility entrance using a key card. Moreau had, not the same credentials as before, a different access level that Abigail didn't ask about, and came up through the basement level where the mechanical systems ran. HVAC, electrical distribution, the hospital's backup power interface. Abigail knew this level the same way she knew the rest of the building, from the kind of general spatial awareness she'd developed as habit, and she led Moreau through the corridor grid without hesitation. The lights went out at 3:34 in the morning, not gradually, not a flicker. Total, building-wide cutoff, the kind that killed the ambient hum of equipment and left only the brief dark before the emergency generator system engaged. Holloway's backup power came online in 11 seconds, which was within specification, dropping the building into the amber-tinted reduced lighting of emergency mode. The ICU and OR would be on full backup. The general floor corridors would be running at 60%. Abigail stopped moving the instant the main power cut. "That's not a system fault," she said. "No. Someone cut the primary feed." "Yes." She stood in the basement corridor in the amber half-light, and she understood what was happening with the specific, calm, nauseating clarity of someone whose threat assessment training had just confirmed its worst-case scenario. The building had been isolated. The external surveillance cameras would have switched to battery backup with a 2-minute buffer before the emergency system rerouted power. 2 minutes of darkness on the exterior feeds. Interior cameras were on the same backup generator as the rest of the building, but they were also controlled through the security office. And if the security office had been compromised— "How many?" she asked. "I don't know. At least 4 inside based on what we've seen. There may be more. They're not here for the drive anymore." Bricks was unreachable, which means they've either gotten to him or they know we've already moved the drive and they're cutting their losses. She thought about what cutting losses meant in practical terms, about Marcus in the building, about the 12 gigabytes of documentation that had 4 years of someone's crimes on it. "They're here to eliminate the witnesses." Moreau said nothing because there was nothing to say. "Marcus is still in this building somewhere," Abigail said. "Either he moved himself or someone moved him. Either way, he's the primary witness to what's on that drive. If they get to him, then we find him first." Moreau's voice was precise. "Ground floor or basement level. If he moved himself post-surgery, he couldn't have managed stairs without significant help. Is there anywhere on the ground floor he could have gone to ground?" Abigail thought about the hospital's layout. Ground floor, ER bay, triage, imaging, 2 procedure rooms, the surgical prep corridor. Radiology had lockable interior rooms. The surgical prep area had supply closets that were keyed separately from the main system and were often overlooked in rapid clearance operations because they didn't read as tactical positions. "Surgical prep corridor," she said. "Supply room C is a dead-end entry that reads as a closet on the building schematic. It's actually a 12 by 14 staging room." "How do you know it's on the schematic as a closet?" "Because I asked facilities about storage space my 3rd week, and they showed me the building plans." She was already moving. "Come on, Bidbet." The ground floor was not empty. They knew this before they reached the main corridor junction, because sound carries differently in a building running on emergency power. Less ambient noise to absorb it, the HVAC running at reduced rate. the normal staffing chatter absent because the shift would have moved critical patients and sheltered the rest in place per standard emergency protocol. In that relative quiet, footsteps on linoleum were audible from 40 feet. Abigail counted 2 sets, moving methodically. Room to room, which was a clearance pattern, which confirmed what she'd already determined about what was happening. She pulled Moreau into a lateral corridor and they waited while the footsteps passed the junction. 2 men, armed, moving with the efficiency of people who had done building clearance before. When they'd passed, Abigail crossed the junction at a low angle and continued toward surgical prep. She could feel her knee with every step. Not debilitating, not yet, but accumulating. The surgical prep corridor was dark. The emergency lighting reduced to floor-level strips that cast long shadows upward. She went to supply room C. The door was labeled Materials Storage in the kind of institutional font that made everything look like a fire hazard designation. And she knocked twice, paused, knocked once. Nothing. She tried the handle. Locked. She knocked again. "Marcus, it's Cole." For 3 seconds, nothing. Then the lock disengaged from the inside and the door opened 8 inches, and Marcus Webb looked out at her with the expression of a man who was in considerable pain and was handling it by narrowing his world to the next necessary thing. He was upright, which was remarkable. He was also gray-faced and moving wrong on his left side, which was the surgical side. And she could see even in the dim light that he'd been doing something to manage the wound, because his shirt was folded against it in a way that suggested improvised pressure. "You're bleeding," she said. "Some." He stepped back to let them in. Moreau came through behind Abigail and pulled the door closed. The room was small, lined on 3 sides with shelving. A single emergency light strip in the ceiling giving everything a thin, flat quality. Marcus had positioned himself against the back wall with a clear sightline to the door, which was automatic behavior that Abigail recognized as someone too deep in training to stop even at considerable physical cost. "How bad?" Abigail said, already moving toward him. "Manageable." "That's not an assessment." She got her hands on him, checked the improvised pressure dressing, felt the warmth that meant active bleeding. Not catastrophic, the surgical repair was holding mostly, but post-operative tissue under physical stress in an ambulatory patient, who had no business being ambulatory, was a situation that had its own momentum, and it was not favorable. "You tore the lateral closure. You're losing blood." "I know." "You need to sit down and stay down. There are people in this building trying to kill us." "I'm aware." She looked around the supply shelves. Holloway's surgical prep stockroom carried what she expected: sterile field supplies, wrapped instrument sets, IV consumables, gauze and tape, and irrigation solution. She pulled what she needed with the fast, deliberate selectivity of someone who had performed field medicine in conditions where the supply list was considerably shorter. "Sit down or I can't do anything useful here." He sat. Not gracefully. He managed it the way injured people managed things when their body was no longer reliably cooperating with their instructions. But he sat and he held still, which was the part that mattered. She worked quickly. Irrigation to clean what she could assess, fresh pressure packing, a wrap that would hold under movement better than what he'd improvised. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when there was something specific to do. "The drive," he said. "Moreau has it." He looked at Moreau over Abigail's shoulder. Something passed between them, not words, the shorthand of people who had operated in the same context and didn't need to verbalize the verification. "Bricks," Moreau said quietly. "I don't know if Bricks is compromised or just dark," Marcus said. "His last communication to me was 48 hours ago. He said he had a credible source inside confirming the network had identified the evidence package. Then nothing." "If Bricks is compromised, the federal chain is suspect," Moreau said. "Not all of it. There's a secondary contact. I didn't use her because she's 2 levels removed from the immediate operation, and reaching her takes time I didn't have. Her name is Stanton, S.A.C. Renata Stanton, FBI field office. She's—" "I know who Stanton is," Moreau said. "Then you know she's clean." "I know she was clean 18 months ago." "She's clean." He said it with the flatness of direct knowledge rather than hope. Moreau pulled out her phone. The cellular signal in the supply room was marginal, 1 bar, dropping. She stepped toward the door. I need 30 seconds of signal. I'm going into the corridor. There are 2 men running clearance on this floor, Abigail said. I'll be fast. She slipped out. The door closed. Abigail finished the wrap and pressed Marcus's own hand against it. Hold that. Firm pressure, not tight. I know how pressure works. Then do it correctly. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. In the thin emergency light, he looked like what he was. A man who had absorbed more than his share of damage and was still oriented toward function, because orientation toward function was the only mode he'd ever fully learned. She recognized it. She lived in it too, which was both a shared language and its own kind of problem. You should have warned me 6 days ago, she said. I know. When they pulled your file, I found out after. When you found out, you should have warned me. He looked at her steadily. I should have. I didn't because I didn't want to pull you back into something you'd worked to get clear of. He paused. I was wrong. She didn't say anything because she was deciding whether to pursue it or let it sit, and she decided to let it sit because the supply room was not the venue and the moment was not the time. She filed it with this dosage argument and the Marsh incident and the badge deactivation and everything else that needed a different hour. The door opened. Moreau. Alone. Her expression had changed, not by much, but Abigail read it. Stanton is active, Moreau said. She's been running a parallel operation on the same network for 7 weeks. She has warrants. She's been waiting for the physical evidence. She looked at the case under her arm. This is the piece she's been missing. How long to get a response team here? Marcus asked. She said 40 minutes from authorization. She's authorizing now. We have 40 minutes to keep this room secure, Abigail said. And to keep Webb from losing enough blood to require another surgery, Moreau said, with the particular bluntness of someone who had just assessed a situation and was not softening the math. I'm fine, Marcus said. Both women looked at him. He stopped talking. The sound reached them then. Not close, but approaching. Not the 2-man clearance team they'd been tracking. This was different, more weight, different distribution, the sound of a larger group moving with purpose rather than patience. That's not 2 people, Abigail said. No, Moreau agreed. A third sound, cutting over the first, the emergency alarm system activating. The building-wide alert that meant the hospital's automated protocols were now treating the situation as a mass emergency event, which would trigger external notifications, police, fire, EMS, which was either the best thing that could happen or the worst, depending on how many of those systems had already been compromised by the same network that had cut the power. Abigail stood up. She looked at the supply shelves. She looked at the room's dimensions. She looked at Marcus, who should not be moved, and at Moreau, who was already repositioning, and at the door through which the sounds were getting louder, and she ran the arithmetic of 3 people in a 12 by 14 room against an unknown number in a building where the exits were compromised and the response team was 40 minutes out. We can't hold this room, she said. No, Moreau agreed. We need a different position, something defensible, with more than one exit, that they won't clear first because it doesn't read as a tactical holdout. What are you thinking? Moreau asked. Abigail looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the particular steady attention he'd had since the moment the paramedics brought him in, like she was the fixed point in a room that was moving around her. The trauma bay, she said. Bay 1. It's built for chaos. Multiple entry points they'd have to cover simultaneously, equipment we can use, and it's the last place they'll look for us because it's the most visible room in the building. That's either very smart or completely insane, Marcus said. Yeah. She moved toward the door. Let's find out which. She got her hand on the handle and pulled it open 2 inches to check the corridor, and what she saw on the other side stopped her completely. At the far end of the hallway, in the flat amber of the emergency lighting, a man was standing very still in the center of the corridor. He was not one of the 2-man clearance team. He was taller, broader, dressed in the same nondescript functional clothing but wearing it differently, wearing it the way someone wore a uniform, with that particular quality of ownership. He had a radio in one hand and nothing visible in the other, which was more concerning than the alternative. He was looking directly at the supply room door. He had been looking at it, she realized, for longer than she had been looking at him. He had found them before they opened the door. The knock. the lock disengaging. The 30 seconds Moreau had spent in the corridor. He raised the radio. "Room secured," he said. "All three. Tell Cross we're ready." Abigail went completely still. Cross. She knew that name. She knew it the way you knew the names of things that had altered the fundamental shape of your life, not as information but as weight, as the specific gravity of something that had never fully resolved. She had been told, 4 years ago, in a classified debrief in a room she still sometimes dreamed about, that Damian Cross had died in a vehicle incident outside a forward operating base in circumstances that were not quite credible but had been documented and closed and marked final. The man at the end of the corridor put his radio down and looked at the door. "I know you can hear me, Cole," he said. "We've been waiting for you to come back." She opened the door. Not because she had a plan fully formed, because she understood, with the cold clarity that came from years of operating in situations where hesitation was its own kind of decision, that a closed door was not protection, it was a container. And whatever Damian Cross had waiting at the end of that corridor, she was not going to meet it from inside a supply closet. She stepped out. The corridor stretched between them, maybe 60 feet of amber-lit linoleum, the emergency strips casting everything in the flat, directionless light that made distances hard to judge. Cross stood exactly where he'd been. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe memory had compressed him into something more manageable. His face was older, harder, carrying the particular weathering of someone who had spent years in conditions that didn't allow for maintenance. He had a scar below his left ear that hadn't been there before, running jaw to collar in the distinctive pattern of a blade drawn fast. He looked at her the way people looked at things they'd been thinking about for a long time. "You're supposed to be dead," she said. "Reports were managed." His voice was even. Not gloating, matter of fact, the tone of someone explaining an administrative decision. "Same way everything was managed. You know how that works." "I know how it worked." Past tense. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. "The drive is a problem," he said. "Not an insurmountable one. We've recovered from worse documentation." He took one step forward, unhurried. "What I need from you is simple. The drive web, and your word, which I'm told still means something, that you walk away from this and don't look back. You get your life, your hospital, your career, whatever this is." He gestured at the corridor around them with a minimal movement of his hand. "My hospital already fired me." "That can be fixed." "By you." "By the people I work for." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. Behind her, she could hear Moreau moving Marcus in the supply room, the slow, careful sounds of someone managing a patient who should not be ambulatory. She needed to keep Cross's attention forward. "Who do you work for?" she said. It wasn't a question. He recognized that. "You already know." "I want to hear you say it." His jaw tightened slightly. "Senator Dale Whitmore," he said, "among others. The infrastructure is broader than one name." She had not known the name Whitmore. She'd known there was a political layer above the operational one. The funding had to come from somewhere. The contract modifications had to be authorized by someone with budget access and classification authority. But she hadn't had a name. She had one now. She made sure she remembered it. "The drive goes to the FBI tonight," she said. "That's not a negotiation. That's information." Cross looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible, not uncertainty, the specific arithmetic of someone deciding which kind of force to apply. "You have Webb bleeding in that room. Moreau is one person. The response team you called—" He paused, and the pause told her that he knew about the call, which meant either the signal had been intercepted or Moreau's line was compromised in some way she hadn't known, "is not coming." She kept her face where it was. "Why not?" "Because SAC Stanton had a situation develop at her field office approximately 20 minutes ago that required her immediate attention." He said it cleanly, without visible satisfaction, which was worse than gloating would have been. "She's handling it. She's not coming to Carver's Point tonight." Abigail ran the math. Marcus bleeding, Moreau behind her. Response team blocked. Cross in front with, she looked past him to the far corridor junction and counted, at minimum 3 others visible as silhouettes, which meant more she couldn't see. The math was not good. The math had not been good for most of her adult life, and she had learned, repeatedly, that the math was not the whole equation. Then I guess it's just us, she said. She took a step toward him. He didn't move back. But he hadn't expected her to move forward, and that half second of recalibration was real. You spent 4 years, she said, walking steadily, keeping her voice level and clear, building something on the assumption that the people who knew what you did could be silenced or removed. You built it on the assumption that institutional systems protect the people who operate within them, and that people like me, people who got pushed out, pushed down, suspended, and managed and documented out of the record, would stay gone. She stopped 10 feet from him. You were wrong about all of it. Inspirational, Cross said. The drive is already transmitted. The corridor went very quiet. Cross's expression didn't break entirely, but something shifted beneath it. A fault line, invisible from the outside, now under load. That's not possible. The external network access was cut when the primary power went down. The hospital's internal cellular repeater runs on the ICU backup circuit, she said. It's a separate system from the main network, standard in hospitals this size. It keeps patient communication running during power events. Moreau made a call on it 20 minutes ago. The drive contents were transmitted to a secondary federal contact in encrypted segments. She paused. The physical drive doesn't matter anymore. Everything on it is already where it needs to be. It was partly true. The call had been made. The contact had been reached. Whether the transmission had gone through completely in the 30 seconds of marginal signal Moreau had gotten in the corridor, that she didn't know. She hadn't had time to ask, and Moreau hadn't said. But Cross didn't know what she didn't know, and doubt was its own leverage. His hand moved. She dropped immediately. Not back, sideways toward the wall, because the geometry of a corridor meant backward was the worst direction, and the wall gave her a fixed reference. The shot went past where she'd been standing and hit the far end of the hallway with a sound that was simultaneously enormous and flat in the enclosed space. She moved. Not toward Cross, past him, low and fast, toward the corridor junction where his 3 visible people were reacting to the shot with the half-second lag of people who hadn't expected their commander to fire in a hospital hallway. She hit the first one in the throat with the heel of her palm while he was still processing, got her hand on the second one's weapon arm before he could reorient, redirected, and locked the joint, felt the weapon drop, and was through the junction before the third one had fully closed the distance. Behind her, Moreau. She heard it without seeing it, the sounds of someone who had been doing this longer than Abigail and had stopped finding it difficult. She ran for the trauma bay. Bay 1 was exactly what she'd said it was. Built for chaos. 4 entry points, main corridor, ambulance bay doors, the internal access from surgical prep, and the supply hatch in the rear wall. Equipment on every surface. Crash cart, defibrillator, ventilator stack, 2 procedure stations, IV poles, the monitor array above the primary bed. The overhead lights were on emergency power, but brighter than the corridors because the trauma bay ran on the dedicated critical circuit. She came through the internal access at a run and took stock in under 2 seconds. The main corridor doors were closed. Ambulance bay doors were locked from inside. She crossed to the manual lock and engaged the secondary bar. Supply hatch. She moved a procedure cart in front of it, which wouldn't stop anyone who knew it was there, but would buy noise. She checked the primary bed, the floor space, the equipment positions. She was building a room in her head. Not the room as it was decorated, the room as a set of distances and angles and usable objects. Moreau came through the internal access 30 seconds after her, supporting Marcus. He was on his feet, barely. His color had dropped another grade since the supply room, and the improvised dressing Abigail had applied was showing through his shirt on the left side. Not soaked, not catastrophic, but the kind of progressive that had a clock on it. She got him to the primary bed. He sat on the edge rather than lying down, because lying down was a position he apparently wasn't willing to accept yet, and she didn't fight it because the argument would cost more time than the compromise. "How long?" he said. "I don't know. Best guess." She checked the dressing, adjusted the pressure, looked at his face. 30 minutes before this becomes a problem I can't manage with what's in this room. Maybe 40 if you stay still and your pressure holds. He nodded once, filed it somewhere. Cross. In the building. He's got at least 4 people, probably more. He knows where we are. "You did the thing," Marcus said. "What thing?" The thing where you say something that's almost true and let them fill in the rest themselves. It may have bought us time. May have. He looked at Moreau. Stanton. Blocked, Moreau said. Cross says her field office had an incident. Fabricated. Almost certainly, but it's still keeping her occupied. Moreau had positioned herself near the main corridor doors, listening to the sounds beyond. The building alarm had stopped, which meant someone had manually cut it, which meant they had access to the security systems. We have the drive, and we have 3 witnesses to Cross's identity and to what he said in that corridor. If we can hold until... You said the response team isn't coming, Marcus said. The direct response isn't, but Stanton's secondary network. She has a protocol for field office obstruction. If her office was hit, she activates the protocol, which routes through a different command chain. It's slower, but it exists. How much slower? An hour, possibly 90 minutes. Nobody said what an hour meant for Marcus's blood pressure and the dressing on his left side. Nobody needed to. Abigail moved to the crash cart and started pulling what she actually needed. 2 large-bore IV catheters, a bag of normal saline, the pressure tubing, tape. She worked while she talked because standing still was not something she'd ever been good at when there was something to do. Cross mentioned Senator Whitmore, she said. Moreau went very still. By name? By name. He said Whitmore and others. He called it infrastructure. Moreau turned from the door. Her expression was the most unguarded Abigail had seen it in years. Not fear, something more complex. The look of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed at a scope that was still settling in. Whitmore sits on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Moreau said. He has oversight authority over the exact programs that the drive documents, Marcus said. Yeah, that's not a coincidence. Whitmore isn't just a funder. He's been running interference at the federal level for 4 years. Every time an investigation got close to the procurement fraud, it hit a wall. He was the wall. Then Stanton's blockage tonight, Abigail said. Came from above her, Moreau finished. Possibly from above her director. She pressed her hand flat against the corridor door, feeling rather than hearing. We need to get that name into the record before anything else happens in this building. If Cross gets to Webb, then Webb's testimony about the conversation in that corridor disappears, Abigail said. And mine goes unverified. And Cross claims whatever he wants about tonight. She looked at Marcus. He had the IV in his arm now. She'd placed it in under 45 seconds, which was fast even for her, and the saline was running and she'd taped it down with the specific tension that would hold through movement if it came to that. Can you record? She said. He looked at her. Your phone. Battery's at 11%. That's enough. He pulled it out and started a voice memo without further discussion. She looked at the camera on the wall, emergency power, still running, feeding to the security system that Cross's people had accessed. She thought about that. The security footage was being monitored, but monitoring wasn't the same as controlling. The footage was also being written to a local server that backed up to an external archive every 15 minutes. The last backup would have been at 3:30. It was 3:47. Everything that had happened in this building since 3:30, every corridor, every camera angle, every room with a feed, was on that local server and had not yet been overwritten or deleted. And in 13 minutes, it would back up again. Moreau, she said. The security server? It's in the basement. Facilities room marked environmental control. It's not the security office. It's a physical backup node. If someone gets to it before Cross's people realize what it is, I can't leave this position. I know. Abigail looked at the ambulance bay doors. Beyond them was the external ambulance bay, and beyond that was the street, and the building's external cellular signal was stronger on that side than anywhere else in the structure. She looked at Marcus's phone. 11%. She looked at her own. 6%. She'd been running searches and navigation all night. Between them, maybe enough. I'm going to the security server, she said. Marcus started to stand up. No. Her voice was flat. You are going to stay on that bed and maintain pressure and not do anything that accelerates the bleeding. That is your entire job for the next 20 minutes. He stopped. You can't go alone, Moreau said. I'm not going to the server alone. She moved to the supply hatch, shifted the procedure cart aside. I'm going to pick up something on the way. The something was Nadia Vasquez. It was a long shot. Nadia's shift had been a break rotation, which meant she could have been back on a call by now, could have been anywhere in the city. But Carver's Point EMS routed its Southside units through Holloway's ambulance bay as a staging point on night shifts, which Abigail had learned from 3 months of watching which units came and went during her overnight rotations. She came out through the supply hatch into the service corridor, through the external bay door, into the rain. 2 ambulances in the staging area. Unit 7 was dark. Unit 11 had its interior light on. Abigail crossed the wet asphalt at a run and knocked on the passenger window. Nadia Vasquez looked up from a tablet, registered Abigail's face through the glass, and had the door open before Abigail got her hand to the handle. The basement facilities corridor was clear. Whatever Cross's team was doing on the upper floors, they hadn't gotten to the basement node yet. Either they didn't know it existed or they hadn't prioritized it. Abigail moved fast, Nadia beside her, both of them staying low at corridor intersections and moving in the stop-check-move pattern that covered ground quickly without being stupid about it. The room marked Environmental Control was at the end of the East Wing basement, behind a door that required a facilities key. Abigail didn't have one. She looked at the lock, looked at the door frame, and made a decision that the building maintenance department was going to be mildly annoyed about. The door was interior grade, not secured, and the frame was standard. She hit it at the right angle with her shoulder and felt it give on the second impact, the latch breaking free of the housing. Inside, HV. AC control panels, the building's electrical distribution boards, and in the back corner, a rack-mounted server unit that was exactly what she'd expected. A physical backup node running on battery power with a green status light indicating it was still writing. She pulled out Marcus's phone. The voice memo was still running. She'd carried it from the bay, which meant the last 10 minutes of ambient sound were on it, including Nadia's acknowledgement of the situation in the ambulance, which constituted an additional witness statement. She found the server's external port, connected Marcus's phone with the charging cable she'd taken from the supply room, and started a data pull. The phone wasn't built for this, and the connection was wrong in 3 different ways, but the security footage archive was accessible on the local network, and Marcus's phone had the file manager app that she was making decisions faster than she was verifying them, which was how she'd operated for most of the last decade when the alternative was not operating at all. The pull started, slow. 11% battery, dropping. "How long?" Nadia said. "I don't know. Keep watching the door." The footage archived in 15-minute segments. She targeted the 3:30 to 3:47 window, the period that contained the power cutoff, the corridor confrontation, cross-identifying himself, cross-naming Whitmore. If even the audio captured through ambient camera pickup, the phone hit 4%. 3. She looked at the progress bar. 40% of the target segment, 2%. "Come on," she said, which was not a tactical statement. 1%. The transfer completed at 63% of the target segment, and the phone went dark. She held it for a second. 63%, which included the power cutoff and the corridor approach, and she tried to remember the exact timing, possibly the conversation, possibly Whitmore's name. She didn't know. She wouldn't know until the phone was charged and the file was opened and someone with the right access could tell her what was on it. What she knew was that the file existed, that it was on a phone that was now a dead brick in her hand, and that the physical server was still running and had the complete archive on it, and that Cross's people had not found this room yet. "We need to lock this room from the inside and hold it," she said. "The door's broken," Nadia said. "I know." Abigail looked around the room. "Help me move the distribution panel." They moved it. It was bolted to the floor. They didn't move it far, but far enough to brace it against the broken door frame in a way that would slow forced entry for longer than an unsupported door. Not indefinitely. But time was the only currency she had left, and she was spending it on minutes. She sat down on the floor with her back against the panel, and for the first time in, she didn't know how long, she let herself stop moving. Her knee was properly bad now, the joint swollen enough that she could feel it against the fabric of her scrubs. Her lip had reopened somewhere in the last hour. She was running on adrenaline and terrible coffee and the specific determination of someone who had decided, at some point she couldn't precisely identify, that she was not going to let this be the outcome. Nadia sat down beside her. That man you mentioned, Nadia said. Cross, you knew him before. Yes. What did he do? Abigail looked at the green light on the server rack. Still running, still writing. He ran operations that were supposed to be legitimate military contracting, equipment procurement, logistics support. He took the contracts, inflated the costs, funneled the difference, and when anyone got close to the discrepancy, he made sure they stopped getting close. She paused. 6 people died in incidents that were classified as accidents. They weren't accidents. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Were any of them yours? The question landed exactly where it was aimed. Abigail looked at the floor. 2 of them, she said. Yes. She hadn't said that out loud before. Not in those words, not to anyone outside a classified debrief that had subsequently been buried. It sat in the room between them without requiring a response. The sound came at 4:19 a.m. Not the panel, not the door, but from outside. Multiple vehicles, the specific diesel rumble of heavy transport that didn't belong to civilian EMS, and then radio static from Nadia's unit clipped to her jacket, the dispatcher's voice cutting through with a tone that indicated something had shifted in the city's operational picture. Nadia listened. Her expression changed. What? Abigail said. Federal Response Team, just staged outside Holloway. Nadia looked at her. 6 units. They're asking EMS to hold positions. Abigail processed this. Stanton's secondary protocol. Slower, but it had come. How long ago did they stage? Dispatch says they went active 4 minutes ago. Nadia pressed the radio. Unit 11 to dispatch. Confirm federal units are Holloway specific? Confirmed. Unit 11. FBI field response. Direct authorization. All civilian units hold exterior positions until cleared. Abigail stood up. Her knee argued with her. She overruled it. She moved the distribution panel back far enough to open the broken door and stepped into the corridor, and the basement was still dark and still quiet. But the quality of the silence had changed. The particular change that happened when a building's external pressure shifted, when the forces operating inside it began to understand that the geometry of their situation had become unfavorable. She went up the stairwell. Ground floor, main corridor. The man who had been posted outside room 214 earlier, who Moreau had put on the floor, was gone. 2 of Cross's team were visible at the far end of the main corridor, and they were not moving in the clearance pattern anymore. They were standing with the body language of people receiving new information and not finding it comfortable. Someone's radio crackled. A voice she didn't recognize said, "Building is surrounded. Federal authorization. Stand down." One of the 2 men at the far end looked at the other. Neither of them moved immediately. Abigail walked toward the trauma bay. She walked through the main corridor in the amber emergency light, with her dead phone in her hand and her knee slowing her down and the dried blood on her lip that she kept tasting when she breathed through her mouth. And she walked past 2 of Cross's armed men who watched her go with the particular paralysis of people whose organization was collapsing faster than their individual responses could keep up with. She pushed through the trauma bay door. Moreau was still at the corridor entry. Marcus was still on the bed, saline still running, considerably paler than he'd been but upright, watching the door. When he saw her, the 2% of tension he'd been carrying released the same way it had in room 214, the same involuntary calibration. "Response team's here," she said. "I heard the radio," Moreau said. "Stanton's protocol." It worked. Moreau said it without visible relief, which was simply how she processed good news, internally, privately, where it didn't interfere with the next assessment. Abigail crossed to Marcus and checked his IV, checked the dressing. The bleeding had slowed. Not stopped, slowed. He needed a proper surgical review within the next 2 hours. She was going to make sure he got it. "Cross name Whitmore," she told Moreau. "In the corridor, out loud, by name." Moreau looked at her carefully. "You have it documented." Partial footage from the security archive. Voice memo with ambient capture. 2 witnesses, you and Nadia Vasquez from EMS, who also received the drive from Webb and can speak to the chain of custody. She set Marcus's dead phone on the procedure tray beside the bed. "The phone needs charging. When it turns on, there's footage and audio on it. Moreau took the phone without a word and produced a charging cable from somewhere inside her coat with the practicality of someone who had learned to carry what they needed. From outside the trauma bay, the sounds of the building changed again, the brisk, coordinated movement of a federal response team doing its job, the specific verbal exchanges of people executing a clear and authorized operation. Abigail heard the words on the ground, hands from somewhere in the main corridor, and then the clatter of dropped weapons, and then a voice she didn't recognize calling out, clear in the tone that meant the threat assessment had shifted from active to contained. She sat down on the stool beside Marcus's bed. She hadn't sat down voluntarily she stopped trying to calculate it. "It's over," Marcus said. "Not yet," she said. "But the hard part is..." He looked at her. "You doing okay?" "Ask me in an hour." "I'm asking now." She thought about it honestly. Her knee was bad. Her lip was open again. She'd been awake for 22 hours and she was operating on reserves she usually kept for genuine emergencies, which this had been, but was hopefully finishing being. She was sitting in a trauma bay she'd been fired from working in, next to a man she hadn't seen in over a year, with a federal response team clearing the building around her and a dead phone on a procedure tray that might have a senator's name on it. "I'm functional," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I'm okay," she said. "I'll be okay." He nodded once, filed it. The trauma bay door opened. She expected federal agents. Instead, a woman, late 40s, dark suit, FBI credentials held up in her left hand and a phone in her right, that she was already talking into when she pushed through the door. She stopped when she saw the three of them, clocked the situation in under 3 seconds, with the practiced speed of someone who dealt regularly in complicated rooms. "SAC Renata Stanton," she said, to the room generally, and Moreau specifically. "Colonel..." "Agent Stanton." Moreau's voice was neutral. "You made it." The field office situation resolved faster than they intended. Their operation was coordinated, but their execution was... She paused, and there was something sharp and satisfied in the pause. "Not quite sharp enough." She looked at Marcus, at the IV, at Abigail. "Who's the medical?" "I am," Abigail said. "He needs a hospital." "He's in one. He needs surgical review within 2 hours." "We can arrange that." Stanton looked at her more fully. "You're Cole." "Yes." "Moreau briefed me on the drive transmission. We're pulling the archive now." She held up the phone. "I need a verbal confirmation of the name you were given in this building tonight. For the record, right now." Abigail looked at her steadily. "Senator Dale Whitmore," she said clearly. "I was told directly by Damian Cross at approximately 3:40 a.m. in the ground floor surgical prep corridor of this building that Whitmore was funding and protecting the operation. Cross used those words, the people I work for, and named Whitmore specifically when I pressed. Stanton was already transmitting. She said something into the phone that Abigail didn't fully catch, something with a case number and a reference designation, and then she lowered the phone and looked at Moreau again. "Cross," she said. "He was in the corridor approximately..." Moreau checked her watch. 31 minutes ago." "He's not in the building," Stanton said. "We've cleared 4 floors. His team is contained, 7 in custody, but Cross himself..." She stopped. Abigail looked up from Marcus's dressing. "He's not here," Stanton said. "He cleared the building before we staged." The room was very quiet. "He knew you were coming," Moreau said. "He had to have had advance notice of the protocol activation." Stanton's jaw was set. Which means Whitmore was monitoring the secondary command chain," Moreau said. "Which means the senator's reach goes further into federal infrastructure than we thought." Stanton looked at Abigail, and Abigail looked back at her, at this federal agent with her credentials and her authorization and her response team that had arrived in time and was nevertheless standing in a cleared building with 7 of Cross's people in custody, and Cross himself somewhere in the rainy dark of Carver's Point. "He's going to run," Abigail said. "We have his description out." "He's been running for 4 years as a dead man," Abigail said. "He's very good at this." Stanton knew that. She didn't need Abigail to tell her. The expression on her face said she knew it and was deciding what to do with knowing it, and the decision she was arriving at was not one that made her look comfortable. The drive contents confirm the casualty records, Stanton said, quieter now. All 6. We have enough to move on Whitmore within hours regardless of Cross. Whitmore's the priority. And Cross walks. For now, for tonight. Stanton looked at her directly. Not permanently. Abigail looked at the dead phone on the procedure tray. She thought about Cross in that corridor, looking at her with 4 years of unresolved intention in his face, telling her he'd been waiting. She thought about what waiting meant to a man who had faked his death and built an infrastructure on silence and managed every threat with the calm efficiency of someone who had stopped experiencing consequences. She thought about the 6 casualty files on the drive, the 2 that were hers. Cole, Marcus said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that same fixed attention, reading her the way people read each other when they'd been in enough situations together that words were partially optional. Let Stanton work, he said. She just told me he's gone. I know. Let her work. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at the door. Beyond it, Carver's Point was still dark, still raining, the city doing what cities did during the hours before dawn, moving without full awareness of what had happened inside one of its buildings, what names had been spoken, what evidence had been captured, what was about to begin falling apart in the offices of people who had spent years believing themselves untouchable. Cross was in that dark somewhere, and so was every piece of what she'd built here. 14 months of shifts of quiet efficiency, of knowing the supply room layouts and the camera blind spots in which backup circuit ran the cellular repeater. Every small thing she'd learned while being treated like someone who didn't need to know anything important. She looked at Stanton. There's security footage on a local server in the basement, she said. Environmental Control Room, East Wing. The archive from 3:30 to 3:47 contains audio and visual record of Cross's presence in this building and the conversation in the surgical prep corridor. She paused. The door's broken. My fault. The physical server is intact. Stanton was already on her phone. There's one more thing, Abigail said. Stanton looked at her. Deputy Administrator Croft placed a call at approximately 11 p.m. that was used to coordinate the men who followed us from this building. The call log is on a phone that Moreau recovered from one of them. Croft is still somewhere in this building. Stanton lowered her phone. And Dr. Elliot Marsh, Abigail continued, her voice carrying the specific quality of someone who had been waiting to say something for a long time and was choosing now because the moment had finally arrived, filed a preemptive false report today to cover physical assault on a staff member. That report was processed in 45 minutes by a deputy administrator who also coordinated with armed operatives. The assault happened in front of 30 witnesses who said nothing. She looked at Stanton directly. I would like those things to be part of whatever record is being built tonight. Stanton studied her. They will be, she said. And somewhere in the building, above them, in the corridors being cleared room by room, or outside in the parking structure where it had all begun, or in the administrative offices where records sat waiting, the weight of everything that had been managed and buried and documented away from accountability was beginning, finally, to shift. The door to the trauma bay opened again. A federal agent, young, vest, credentials, leaned in and said something to Stanton in a low voice. Stanton listened, and the expression that crossed her face was complicated and immediate and specific enough that Abigail straightened from the stool before she'd consciously decided to. They found Croft, Stanton said. In custody? In his office. She paused. He was on the phone when they came through the door. They took the phone. The number he was calling, she looked at the agent who confirmed something with a nod, belongs to a mobile registered to an address in Washington, D.C. Abigail looked at Moreau. Moreau's expression said what neither of them said aloud. Whitmore. Croft had been calling Whitmore when the federal team found him, which meant Whitmore now knew the building was compromised, which meant Whitmore had... Stanton's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 4 seconds, and her face went very still. Senator Whitmore's office issued a statement 6 minutes ago, she said slowly, still reading something on her screen. He's claiming this is a politically motivated operation targeting federal oversight work. He's going public. She looked up. He's going to get in front of it. The room absorbed this. Marcus said very quietly, he's panicking. He's trying to control the frame before the drive contents go public, Moreau said. Which means he knows they're going public, Abigail said. which means he knows he's already lost. Nobody argued with that. But she was also looking at Stanton, and Stanton was looking at her phone, and the expression on Stanton's face was that of someone who was doing the math on a corrupt senator with media access and political infrastructure and the ability to shape a narrative in the 48 hours before charges were formally filed, versus a partial security archive on a dead phone and the testimony of 3 people, one of them a suspended nurse, one of them a formerly retired military officer, one of them a post-surgical patient bleeding through a field dressing, in a trauma bay in Carver's Point. "We need the full archive," Stanton said, "and we need Cross." She walked out of the bay with the federal agent already working the phone. The door swung closed behind her. Abigail sat back down on the stool. She checked Marcus's dressing, still holding. She adjusted the saline rate. She looked at the IV site, the tape, the calibration of what she'd placed under conditions that were not optimal. It was all still functional, just like she was. Barely. But that had always been enough. "Cole," Moreau said. She looked up. Moreau was standing by the corridor door, and her face had the look it got when something had just resolved in her mind into a clarity she hadn't had before. "The parking structure," Moreau said. "Where we were followed. The 2 men. What about them?" "They were left there, unconscious, not Cross's people, a separate team, less coordinated." She paused. "I went through the heavier man's phone and sent the call log to you, but I also looked at his GPS history." Another pause. "He'd been to 3 locations tonight before the parking structure. The last one was a storage facility on the east side of the city." She pulled her own phone, showed Abigail the screen. A map, a pin, an address. "Cross always uses separate logistics. He never carries anything himself. If the drive wasn't his only copy, he'd have a backup position," Abigail said. "Yes. And if he ran, he'd go to the backup position before he left the city." Abigail looked at the address, looked at Stanton's retreating position through the small window of the bay door, looked at Marcus, who had heard every word and whose expression said, "I would tell you not to go, but I already know you're going." She looked at her knee. She looked at Moreau. "You're not going without me," Moreau said. "I know. You also can't drive with that knee." "I know that too." Moreau was already moving toward the door. Abigail stood up, put her hand briefly on Marcus's forearm. Not a dramatic gesture, just contact, the simple physical acknowledgement between people who understood each other's choices even when those choices were costly. And then she followed Moreau out of the trauma bay, through the federal team's cordoned activity, and toward the exit. Behind them, Senator Dale Whitmore was issuing statements from Washington. In front of them, Damian Cross had a 15-minute head start and a storage unit on the east side of a city that didn't yet know his name. And somewhere between those 2 facts was the last piece of everything. The storage facility on Eastwick Industrial Road was the kind of place that existed specifically to not be looked at. A long, low building behind a chain-link fence, orange security lights, rows of numbered roll-up doors. At 4:31 in the morning, it should have been empty of everything except whatever people stored in facilities they didn't want in their homes. But the gate was open, not forced, opened with a code recently, the mechanism still blinking its green confirmation. Moreau killed the headlights 2 blocks out and coasted to a stop. They sat in the dark for 30 seconds, reading the lot. One vehicle near the far end. Engine off, but the hood was still ticking, which meant it had arrived recently. No visible movement. The orange security lights threw long shadows between the storage rows and made the distances deceptive. "Unit number?" Abigail said. Moreau checked the phone. The GPS history shows the heaviest clustering around the East End. Last 4 visits, same area. "That's a guess?" "Everything from here is a guess." Abigail opened the door. Her knee had stiffened fully during the short drive, and the first step on the asphalt was a specific kind of unpleasant that she didn't have time to accommodate. She walked through it. The rain had dropped to a fine mist that caught the orange light and made everything look slightly unreal, the kind of atmospheric condition that felt designed rather than weathered into. They moved along the fence line using the building's shadow, working toward the far end of the facility without crossing the open central aisle. Moreau was ahead and to the left, moving with the economy of someone who had done this in conditions considerably more hostile than a misted storage lot in Carver's Point, and Abigail matched her pace and let the familiarity of the pattern carry her past the mechanical difficulty of her leg. Unit 47 had its door raised 8 inches from the ground. Light came from inside. Not much. A work lamp. And sound. The specific rapid movements of someone pulling items and discarding others. The sounds of someone choosing what they could carry and what they had to leave. Moreau stopped, held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the raised door, then made a flat horizontal motion. You go low, I go high. Abigail nodded. She got down on one knee, the good one, and looked through the gap under the door. Cross was inside. He had a duffel on the floor, half packed, and he was moving between a shelving unit and the bag with the targeted efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. There was a secondary drive on the shelf, the backup Moreau had predicted, and he was reaching for it when Abigail pulled the door up and came through at a low angle. He moved fast. She'd expected that. He was bigger and he was fresh in a way she wasn't, and he had the specific compact violence of someone who had spent years in environments where violence was a professional tool. He caught her shoulder and used her momentum to redirect her into the shelving, and she hit it hard enough that a row of containers came down, and she was already moving before they landed because impact absorption was one of those skills that embedded itself so deep you stopped knowing you had it. She got her arm around his from behind. Not a hold she could maintain, the leverage was wrong, but she held it long enough for Moreau to come through the door and take the angle she couldn't. It lasted 45 more seconds. At the end of those 45 seconds, Cross was on the ground with his hands behind his back and Moreau's knee between his shoulder blades, and Abigail was standing against the far wall of the storage unit, breathing through her nose in the deliberate way she used when her body needed oxygen faster than her composure wanted to show. Cross turned his head and looked at her from the floor. He didn't say anything immediately. He was processing. She could see it, the rapid recalculation of someone whose options had just collapsed to a single point. He was not panicking. That was the thing about men like Cross. They didn't panic, they adapted. And even on the ground in a storage unit in the rain at 4:30 in the morning, some part of him was looking for the next angle. "It's over," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You know what's coming," he said. "Whitmore has 3 lawyers between him and any charge you put forward. The drive contents are going to get tied up in classification disputes for 2 years. You think tonight changes anything permanently? I think tonight changes enough. You're a suspended nurse in a building you got walked out of," he said. "That's what you are on paper. That's what they'll say." "Then they'll be wrong on paper," she said. "Same as they've been wrong about me in person." She reached past Moreau and picked up the backup drive from where it had fallen. She held it at her side. "The thing you never understood about people like me," she said, "is that we don't need you to know who we are. We just need to outlast you." She stepped back and let Moreau manage the rest, because Moreau was better at it and her knee was done negotiating. Stanton arrived at the storage facility at 4:58 a.m. with 2 vehicles and 4 agents, having tracked Moreau's phone signal. She stood in the doorway of Unit 47 and looked at Cross on the ground, and at Abigail sitting on an overturned container with the backup drive in her lap, and her leg extended straight in front of her because bending it was no longer a viable option. Stanton looked at all of this. "The knee," she said. "I'll live. You need imaging. I need it to be morning first." Stanton crouched down in front of Cross and looked at him with the focused attention of someone who had been building toward this specific moment for 7 weeks. She didn't say anything elaborate. She read him his rights in the flat, procedural cadence of someone for whom this was the end of a long process, rather than a dramatic confrontation, and he listened with his face against the storage unit floor, and when she finished, he said nothing. They took him out. Abigail watched them walk him to the vehicle, his hands bound, his posture still carrying that particular quality of compressed control, and she didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. There was no particular satisfaction in it, not the clean, resolving kind. He was in custody, and the backup drive was in Stanton's hands, and the archive was on a server in Holloway's basement, and Marcus was in a trauma bay getting the surgical review he needed, and the feeling she actually had was something closer to tired than triumphant. Which was, she thought, probably the most honest version of how this kind of thing ended. Senator Dale Whitmore was arrested at his Washington residence at 7:14 a.m. Abigail learned this from Moreau, who told her in the Holloway ER waiting room while a physician she didn't know was reviewing the imaging on her knee. A significant lateral ligament sprain, nothing torn, managed with a compression brace and the kind of instructions about rest and elevation that she filed away without intending to follow for at least the next week. Federal charges were filed the same morning. Procurement fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 6 counts related to the falsification of military casualty records. The specific counts and the specific names attached to them were public within 4 hours, which meant by 11 a.m., every major news outlet in the country was carrying Whitmore's name and photograph alongside the phrase federal indictment and a case number that would eventually grow into one of the more significant military contracting corruption prosecutions in the last decade. It was not a clean, neat, instantaneous collapse. These things never were. There were lawyers and press statements and carefully worded denials, and the particular machinery of powerful people trying to slow the inevitable. Whitmore maintained a public posture of composed outrage for approximately 18 hours before a second wave of documentation, pulled from the server archive, became available to Stanton's team, and the posture became untenable. Cross provided nothing voluntarily. That was expected. What he hadn't anticipated was that 7 members of his team, faced with federal charges and the complete evidentiary picture from the drive, began making individual decisions about cooperation within 48 hours of their arrest. The network was not loyal in the way Cross had built it to be, because networks built on money and fear had a specific structural weakness. When the money stopped and the fear shifted directions, the loyalty went with them. Deputy Administrator Croft was suspended pending investigation by Holloway's board within 6 hours of the federal team's departure from the hospital. He resigned 4 days later before the investigation completed, which was the move of someone whose attorney had reviewed the evidence and recommended preemptive distance. It did not help him as much as he hoped. Dr. Elliot Marsh's situation moved on a separate track, which was the right track for it. Institutional accountability rather than federal, slower, requiring the kind of sustained pressure that didn't arrive in a single night. But it arrived. 3 nurses came forward with documented accounts within a week of the incident report becoming visible in the hospital's review process. Accounts that had existed in private for years and had never been formalized because formalization in an institution that protected Marsh had seemed pointless. It stopped seeming pointless when the deputy administrator who ran that protection was no longer in his office. A 4th account came from a resident who had witnessed the corridor incident directly and had said nothing in the moment and had been carrying it since. The board opened a formal disciplinary review. Marsh's surgical privileges were suspended pending its outcome. The process was neither fast nor guaranteed, but it was real. And it was happening. And the thing that made it happen was not any single dramatic act. It was the cumulative weight of people deciding, one after another, that staying quiet was no longer the path of least resistance. Abigail did not attend any of those proceedings. She submitted her written account, her documentation, her statement. She answered the questions she was asked clearly and without embellishment, and then she went back to the work. Marcus was discharged from Holloway 11 days after his surgery. He walked out under his own power, which she'd told him was inadvisable given the repair, and he'd listened to her the same way he always listened to medical advice, with complete attention and then his own assessment of risk tolerance, which consistently arrived at a different answer than hers. She was waiting in the lobby, not because she'd planned to be. She was there for a shift, or what was beginning again to be a shift, because her credentials had been reinstated 6 days prior in a process that had been considerably less efficient than the 45 minutes it had taken to suspend them and had required 3 separate administrative approvals. She'd submitted the paperwork, answered the questions, waited, and eventually gotten back what had been taken. She wasn't doing it for the credential. She was doing it because the work was the work, and she was good at it, and the patients in Holloway General were not responsible for what their administrators had done in the dark. Marcus came through the elevator doors with his discharge paperwork folded in his hand and a jacket that was too thin for October, and the slightly wary look of a man who had been in a controlled environment for 11 days and was reassessing a world that had changed shape while he was in it. He saw her. "You didn't have to wait," he said. "I'm not waiting, I'm working. You walk through my floor." "The lobby is your floor?" It is when a post-surgical patient I personally managed is being discharged without proper outerwear in 40-degree weather. He looked down at his jacket. It's a good jacket. It's insufficient. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her scrub's pocket, a referral form for his follow-up care, which she'd already coordinated with the surgical team, because coordinating things was faster than explaining why they hadn't been coordinated. Your follow-up is at the Vascular and Thoracic Clinic on Mercer Street, Thursday, 2 p.m. Don't cancel it. He took the paper, looked at it, looked at her. Abby, he said, don't. I was going to say thank you. She looked at him. You were going to say more than that. Yeah. He folded the referral carefully and put it in his pocket. I was going to say I'm sorry I pulled you back into something you'd worked to get clear of. And that the two people on that casualty list, I know, I've always known. The lobby was doing what hospital lobbies do, moving around them, visitors and staff, and the ambient motion of a building that never fully stopped. Nobody was paying attention to two people standing near the elevator. I didn't get clear, she said. I just got quiet. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. She'd thought about this in the 11 days since the storage unit, in the hours between shifts and the long flat time of the early mornings before Holloway got busy. She'd thought about what it meant to walk away from something versus what it meant to set it down temporarily because you didn't yet have a place to put it. Getting clear would have meant it was finished. It wasn't finished. It was just waiting. He nodded slowly. What happens now? Stanton's team is in trial prep. They'll need us. She looked at the discharge paperwork in his hand. And you need a coat. He almost smiled. Is that a medical opinion? It's an observation. He looked at her for a moment with that steady attention she'd spent years learning to not need and had apparently never stopped being able to read. You're different, he said. I've been here 14 months. That's not what I mean. She knew what he meant. She'd been thinking about it herself, the particular shift that happened when something you'd been carrying in isolation became something that had been seen. When the people who'd dismissed you as a quiet nurse who showed up for shifts and never pushed back had watched her walk back through the door with her credentials reinstated and her account on record and her name attached to a federal case that was being reported in the national news. She was the same person she'd been when she hit that supply cart and got up off the floor. The work she'd done in between was the same work she'd always been doing. The only thing that had changed was what other people now knew about it. Don't miss your follow-up, she said. She went back to work. Three weeks later, the Holloway General Board of Directors sent a formal written apology to Abigail Cole, which was a document she read once, set on her kitchen table, and did not read again. It was correctly worded, and it acknowledged the specific failures specifically, which she'd been told to consider meaningful and which she did consider meaningful in the structural sense. It would go into the record, it would be referenced in future proceedings, it would matter in ways that extended beyond her. For her personally, it meant less than the morning she walked back into Bay 1 and the charge nurse, Marcus Howell, looked up from the station and said simply, 1204 needs her meds, cart's ready. That was it. No ceremony, no particular acknowledgement, just the assumption, finally uncontested, that she was the person who did this work. She took the cart and she started the round. Doctor, Elliot Marsh's surgical privileges were permanently revoked by Holloway General's board 11 weeks after the disciplinary review opened. He surrendered his medical license to the state board 4 months later, in a negotiated process that his attorney had managed to keep from becoming a full public hearing, but which could not prevent the outcome the evidence required. The 3 sealed complaints in his file were unsealed. The 2 malpractice settlements were disclosed. He was not criminally charged, which was a limitation of what the evidence could support. And that limitation was real and imperfect, and she sat with the imperfection because the alternative was deciding that imperfect outcomes didn't count. They counted, not because they were enough, because they were real, and real was what she had to work with. Senator Whitmore entered a guilty plea on 4 of the federal charges 14 months after his arrest, following a trial preparation period in which the evidentiary picture became comprehensive enough that his legal team revised their assessment of his odds. He received a sentence that was less than what Abigail thought the 6 casualty families deserved, and more than he had believed he would ever face. She watched the sentencing on the news in the break room at Halloway, between a patient handoff and a chart review, standing at the counter with a coffee she hadn't had time to finish. She didn't feel clean relief. She felt the weight of the 6 names and the years between what happened to them and what happened in that courtroom, and she understood that those years didn't compress or disappear because the verdict existed. They just had a different shape now. Damian Cross was extradited from a country that she was told the name of and then told she hadn't been told the name of 9 months after his arrest in the storage facility. His trial was federal, complex, and ongoing in the way that trials involving classified programs in multiple jurisdictions were always ongoing. Her testimony was given and documented and submitted, and she did not attend the proceedings in person because her attorney, a federal public defender who had been assigned to her as a witness and who was quietly excellent, advised that her presence beyond what was required served no additional purpose. She trusted the advice. She gave what was needed and went back to Carver's Point. Nadia Vasquez was commended by Carver's Point EMS for her role in the preservation of evidence, which was a formal commendation that went into her personnel file and which she apparently received with the same practical equanimity she'd shown in the storage room and the ambulance and every other point in that night where she'd been asked to make a decision quickly and had made it correctly. Abigail sent her a note. Not long, she wasn't good at long in writing, just, "You made the right call every time. That matters." A C. Nadia texted back, "So did you. Also, your patient from Bay 1 left you something at the EMS station. I don't know why he left it here. He's weird." The something was a coat, charcoal gray, properly insulated for October, with a note that said, "Medical opinion, adequate for 40 degrees. MW. She wore it to work the next morning. The thing nobody tells you about being underestimated is that it has a cost that runs in both directions. The obvious cost is to the person being dismissed, the accumulated weight of being moved aside, being documented over, being told by 1,000 small institutional gestures that your competence has a ceiling and your presence has a category, and neither of those things are going to change. That cost is real, and it's heavy, and it builds up in ways you don't always notice until you're sitting on the floor of a storage unit at 4:30 in the morning accounting for it. But the other cost, the one that falls on the people doing the underestimating, is that they stop seeing. They stop seeing what's actually in the room with them. They make decisions based on a hierarchy that tells them certain people are manageable, certain threats are containable, certain knowledge exists only in the places they've designated knowledge to exist. And they build their systems on those assumptions, and the systems feel solid, right up until the moment someone they dismissed reaches a ceiling they didn't know was there and keeps going. Abigail Cole had spent 14 months being the nurse nobody looked at twice. She had spent those months learning every supply room, every backup circuit, every camera blind spot. She had spent them doing the math on fluid rates and catching the dosage errors and flagging the things that needed to be flagged, whether or not anyone acknowledged the flag. She had spent them being efficient and quiet and present because the work was real regardless of who was watching it, and the patients were real regardless of what the administration thought of the person caring for them. She had not been waiting for an opportunity to prove something. She had just been doing the work. The proof came when it came because that's how proof works. It accumulates in the space between what people assume and what's actually true, and eventually the distance between those two things becomes impossible to sustain. On a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 months after the night that Halloway General lost power, and Damian Cross said her name in a corridor and everything that had been held down began to surface, Abigail Cole walked into Bay 1 at 6:45 a.m., checked the board, assessed her patient load, and started her shift. Renata Sims was at the nursing station. She looked up when Abigail came in, and she held her gaze for a second longer than the moment required. And then she said, "Busy day." "They usually are," Abigail said. "Yeah." Renata looked back at her screen. Then, without looking up again, "You should know, 3 people from Knights put your name forward for the charge position. When it opens." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "That's the structural oversight role," she said. "Yeah? That involves administration." "Yeah." Renata's voice was carefully even. "Might be useful to have someone in that role who knows how administration can go wrong." Abigail looked at the board. At the patient list, the room assignments, the particular organized chaos of a morning shift preparing to receive the day. She thought about what a charge position meant, the oversight, the documentation, the specific position inside the institution from which you could see things that weren't visible from the floor. The position that Marsh had never wanted a nurse to hold, that Croft had managed to ensure stayed filled with people who understood the hierarchy and stayed inside it. She thought about what it meant to stay inside a place and change it from a position they hadn't expected you to reach. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a no. She picked up the first chart and started reading, and the shift moved around her in the way shifts did, relentlessly, specifically, demanding her full attention and receiving it. A patient in room 4 whose blood pressure was running wrong. A medication interaction that needed a physician's review. An elderly man in room 7 who was frightened and needed someone to explain his diagnosis twice in plain language before it made sense. She explained it twice. She sat on the edge of the chair beside his bed, and she used plain language, and she waited until his expression shifted from frightened to understanding, and then she asked if he had questions, and he had 3, and she answered all 3. It took 11 minutes. Nobody noticed. Nobody wrote it down. It didn't appear in any record. It was just the work. And the work she had learned, had always known,